Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back.
On March 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln gave his second inaugural address.
Keeping his remarks brief, Lincoln reflected on the nearly 4-year Civil War and maintained his hope for the future while refraining from making any predictions. However, the truth was the end was near. Union forces had made several key advancements and secured a string of tactical victories that all but spelled the end for the Confederacy. As Lincoln stood in front of the gathered crowd, there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, the Union would survive. Just 3 weeks later, the country would have its answer when Confederate General Robert E. Lee asked to meet with General Ulysses S. Grant to discuss the terms of surrender on April 9th, 1865. So this week, I am diving into the end of the Civil War. What prompted Lee to reach out? Where did the two men meet? And what did the end of the war mean for both sides? Grab your cup of coffee, peeps. Let's do this. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, the United States was entering its 4th year of bloody internal conflict. While both the Union and the Confederacy had secured important victories throughout the prolonged war, by the winter of 1864, it started to feel as if the tide was turning in favor of the Union. Federal Commander William Tecumseh Sherman successfully overpowered the Confederate city of Atlanta in September of 1864 and began making plans to push his men further into the Confederacy. Originally, the plan was to head south towards Mobile, Alabama. However, Sherman argued that given the port was closed, capturing the city held no strategic value. Instead, Sherman made plans to overpower a city along the eastern seaboard, such as Charleston, North Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia. Lincoln was hesitant about letting Sherman and his men march further into enemy territory, but Sherman made a strong and convincing case to Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant, who in turn convinced Lincoln to approve Sherman's plan. Thus, on November 15, 1864, Sherman launched his March to the Sea. Described by some as psychological warfare, Sherman sought to prove to Southern civilians living deep in the Confederacy that their government would ultimately be unable to protect them. With 60,000 troops at his disposal, Sherman divided his forces and sent half toward Macon, Georgia, and the other towards Augusta. The overwhelming number of men faced just 8,000 opposing forces, all but guaranteeing Sherman would be successful in his plan. Indeed, Union forces took the city of Savannah on December 21, 1864, and Sherman telegraphed the president on the 22nd, offering the city and some captured cotton as a Christmas gift. Sherman and his men showed little mercy to the civilians in the area, and the lack of food prompted more men to desert from the Confederate Army. After successfully capturing Savannah, General Grant requested Sherman and his men as reinforcements in Grant's campaign against Robert E. Lee in Virginia. Headstrong and committed to diminishing the morale of Southern civilians, Sherman pushed back against his commanding officer, instead requesting permission to head toward South Carolina and destroy anything of military value along the way. By overpowering the first state to secede from the Union, Sherman hoped he could, once and for all, break the Confederate spirit. Grant approved of Sherman's plan, and by early 1865, Sherman had successfully captured the capital city. While Sherman was laying waste to the last vestiges of the Confederate Army, General Lee remained in control of his troops in Virginia. Lee launched what would be his final military campaign on March 25th, attacking Union forces at Fort Stedman, just outside of Petersburg. Grant launched a counterattack on April 1st, pushing Lee and his men to retreat. Ever dedicated to the mission, Lee hoped he and his men would be able to reach much-needed supply lines before Union reinforcements arrived. That did not happen, and by April 8th, Confederate forces had completely surrounded Lee and his men. Assessing the situation and realizing there was little hope for survival, Lee apparently said, quote, "Then there is nothing left me to do but go and see General Grant. And I would rather die 1,000 deaths." End quote. Sitting down and penning what was likely the hardest letter of his life, Lee wrote to Grant. He was simple and straight to the point, writing, quote, "I therefore request an interview at such time and place as you may designate to discuss the terms of the surrender of this army." End quote. Grant responded with a letter of his own agreeing to meet with the Confederate commander wherever he wanted and tasked his aide, General Orville Babcock, with delivering his message under a flag of truce. Grant's decision to agree to a meeting angered some under his command, including General Philip Sheridan. Sheridan, who had engaged in scorched earth tactics in the war and was a pivotal component of Lee's forced surrender, wanted to inflict maximum carnage, apparently saying of the surrender, quote, "I wish they had held out an hour longer, and I would have whipped hell out of them." End quote. However, in agreeing to a meeting with the Confederate commander, Grant was following the overall direction and guidance provided by the commander-in-chief, who had indicated that he preferred a more magnanimous approach to ending the war. The two men agreed to meet at William McLean's home, the Appomattox Courthouse, on April 9th, 1865. Lee, who was convinced he would be held as a prisoner, dressed in full military uniform. As biographer Ron Chernow observes of Lee, quote, "At Appomattox Courthouse, he was determined to look the victor, even if he could not be one." End quote. Grant, on the other hand, looked a bit of a mess. Separated from his supply wagon, he did not have a proper change of clothes for the occasion, and instead showed up in a muddy uniform. The two men could not look any different. Lee, dressed in a sharp, clean uniform, his hair white as snow as a result of an exhaustive military campaign, and Grant, still enjoying a youthful look with his mop of brown hair and sloppy apparel. Grant was very aware of his lack of proper uniform, later reflecting, quote, "I was afraid Lee might think I might to show him studied discourtesy by so coming. At least I thought so." End quote. While some have speculated Grant's clothing choice was intentional and a way to show deference to Grant, author Ron Chernow has a different take, writing, quote, "He had no inkling that later historians might be charmed by his outfit or assume that his mud-caked clothes made a political statement." End quote. The pressure of the moment was likely overwhelming for both men. After all, the nation had been tearing itself apart for 4 years. Nearly 11,000 skirmishes had claimed the lives of over 600,000 Americans. If either man failed to secure an agreeable peace, both sides remained poised to resume fighting, though the Confederate soldiers remained at a distinct disadvantage. The conversation between the two commanders was stilted. Grant attempted to make small talk, but Lee, who was facing the end of a long-fought campaign, just wanted to get things over with. The two foes, sitting in a cramped parlor, began discussing the terms of surrender. Grant followed the tone set by President Lincoln in stipulating the requirements, writing, quote, "Rolls of all officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer to be designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate. The officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander to sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the side arms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, officers and men will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by the United States authority, as long as they observe their parole and the laws in force where they may reside." End quote. Grant did not ask for an unconditional surrender. He allowed the opposition to keep their personal property. Again, from Chenal, quote, "With no tinge of malice, Grant's words breathed a spirit of charity reminiscent of Lincoln's second inaugural address," end quote. Lee, who had been preparing for much, much worse, said simply, quote, "This will have the best possible effect upon the men. It will be very gratifying and will do much towards conciliating our people," end quote. With the terms of surrender finalized, Lee asked for one final act of charity from Grant. His men had been surviving on the bare minimum, subsisting on rations of dried corn, and were in need of real food. Would Grant, Lee asked, be amenable to providing food rations to his men? Grant agreed and ordered food for Lee's nearly 24,000 troops. It was a somber moment, and Grant was in no mood to be jubilant. As he later wrote in his memoirs, quote, "I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse," end quote. Their business finished, there was nothing left for the two men to do except depart. Lee exited the parlor and slowly made his way toward his horse Traveler. Grant and several Union officers lifted their hats in honor of Lee, who returned the gesture by tipping his own. As Lee rode out of town, a Pennsylvania regimental band began playing Auld Lang Syne. Lee stared straight ahead as he passed by the Union forces. Upon returning to his command, Lee addressed his troops, saying, quote, "Men, we have fought through the war together. I have done the best that I could for you," end quote. As the weight of reality settled in, Lee and a few of his men wept. Like Lee, many Confederate soldiers had been preparing for the harshest conditions possible for surrender. They were surprised with Grant's charity and appreciative that the Union general permitted them to retain their horses and return to their homes. Being on the winning side, the Union men wanted to celebrate, and while Grant allowed for some fun, he was committed to remaining respectful of his adversary and prevented the artillery from firing a 100-gun salute. Both Grant and Lee kept their camps separate, unsure of how both sides would react, and likely hoping to avoid any violence between the two sides. Likely still a little dazed from the day's events, Grant actually had to be reminded to inform Washington of the surrender. His telegram was brief and without fanfare, saying, quote, "General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself. The accompanying additional correspondence will show the conditions fully," end quote. Lincoln, who left for Washington that morning on the boat the River Queen, did not learn about the surrender until he landed in Washington. Upon hearing the news, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton responded to the telegram with, quote, "Thanks be to Almighty God for the great victory with which he has this day crowned you and the gallant army under your command," end quote. Unlike Grant, Stanton wanted to celebrate and ordered the firing of 500 cannon, which broke windows in homes throughout the city. As word spread throughout the capital, 3,000 residents descended upon the White House, serenading the president and calling on him to deliver a speech. Lincoln was unprepared in the moment and told people to come back the following day. On April 11th, Lincoln gave what would be his last public remarks, where he said of the victory partially, quote, "Let us all join in doing the acts necessary to restoring the proper relations between these states and the Union," end quote. The speech underwhelmed some in the audience who were likely looking to the president to be more celebratory in tone. Although the president was no doubt overjoyed that the war had finally come to an end, he was only too aware of the cost it took. Lincoln had never wanted the war. He had long sought to preserve the Union and spent his first term in office dedicated to trying to find a solution. Now that he had it, he knew it was just the beginning, and that there was still a lot of work to be done in healing the nation as he worked to put it back together. Fighting continued for several months after Appomattox. However, with the surrender of Lee and his army, it was clear the war was over, and only, quote, "the most zealous and desperate could pretend the Union was not already victorious and the Confederacy was destined to end," end quote. Despite it being the end of hostilities, the close of the Civil War prompted more questions than answers. How were Southern states going to be brought back into the Union? Who would be responsible for rebuilding their infrastructure? What did the end of the war mean for newly emancipated African Americans? And what did the assassination of President Lincoln mean for Reconstruction efforts? All questions the nation would debate for decades to come. Looking ahead, friends, we've finally moved into a new era in American history. I will be spending the next several weeks exploring Reconstruction and how it was implemented throughout the country. I hope you all have enjoyed my take on the Civil War, even if I did bypass the battle aspect. Before I sign off today, I wanted to say thank you again for 4 years of Civics and Coffee. Hopefully by now you've listened to the preview of the bonus content you'll get by joining my newly launched Patreon. By joining the Civics and Coffee Patreon, you'll get things like historical stickers and access to an episode of what I'm calling Civics and Coffee After Dark, or Civics and Cocktails. I'm still in the early phases of developing the Patreon, so if you have ideas for what extra bonus items you'd like to see, be sure to let me know. Thanks again, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.